Hello and welcome to Msit 5450, Section 31, Designing and Building a Security Program. My name is Larry Wilson, Cybersecurity Consultant, and this week is Week 3, Engineering and Design Requirements. Here's a copy of the course outline. Week 1, we started the course with course introduction and scope. Week 2, Business Risk Management Requirements. Week 3, which is this week, Engineering Design Requirements. Week 4, next week, technology and operations requirements. So by the time we finish next week's lecture, we will have defined the requirements for the class, which are the requirements for a cybersecurity program. Week 5, 6, and 7, we'll talk about the workload, some of the details on how we manage our cybersecurity controls to meet the goals of our requirements. And finally, week 8, 9, and 10, we'll talk about the deliverables from the Business Risk Management Program, the deliverables of the Engineering Design Program, and the deliverables from the Technology Operations Program. Week 11, 12, 13, 14, we'll talk about newer topics that are coming that will be integrated into our cybersecurity program over time, such as the new attack framework, the MITRE attack framework, the new operations model, the threat detection and response framework, the new application security framework, and the new security controls framework, which is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Framework, or the CMMC framework. And then we'll conclude with a review of the course where we talk about what's current in today's cybersecurity engineering program, which covers weeks 2 through week 10, as well as what's coming in week 11, 12, 13, and 14. So today's agenda, we're focusing on the engineering design requirements. And for that, we'll be using the Department of Homeland Security Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation Program. So part 1, we'll do an overview of the program. Part 2, the CDM program approach. Part 3, the CDM program architecture. Part 4, the CDM program operations. And then we'll conclude with the cyber engineering requirements, frameworks, and deliverables based on the continuous diagnostics and mitigation over the CDM program. And then part 6, we'll apply this case study for engineering on the global healthcare pandemic. Learning objectives from week 3. Objective 1 is to understand the basics of the Homeland Security Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation Program, or the CDM program basics. Learning objective 2 is understand the CDM program approach. Learning objective 3, understand the CDM program architecture. Learning objective 4, understand the CDM program operations. Learning objective 5 is understand cybersecurity engineering requirements, frameworks, and deliverables, where we summarize the engineering requirements as well as the frameworks and the deliverables for engineering. And learning objective 6 is how we apply engineering principles to a global healthcare pandemic. So continuous diagnostics and mitigation is exactly what it's titled. We need a continuous analysis and continuous mitigation of our cybersecurity threats through primarily continuous visibility, where we discover devices, we profile devices, we make sure once we've discovered and we have visibility into our different devices, then we're protecting those. For example, endpoint authentication and inspection protects our endpoints. Network enforcement protects our networks. Endpoint remediation is how we remediate vulnerabilities that we identify through our inspection. And finally, information integration is where we report and measure how well we're doing with our continuous vulnerability or visibility program. So it's a continuous life cycle, continuous diagnostics and mitigation of discovery, protection, enforcement, remediation, and integration through dashboards. So it's a continuous circle on how we have continuously applied our cybersecurity controls to our most critical assets. So what is continuous diagnostics and mitigation? The CDM program is a dynamic approach implementing automated risk-based cybersecurity that assures the security of sensitive data and the provision of essential functions while protecting the sensitive information. The implementation approach is consistent with guidance from the Office of Management and Budget, as well as the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. So it's consistent with the principles that we learned last week of the NIST Risk Management Framework and the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. CDM is a suite of capabilities and tools that enables network administrators to know the state of their respective networks at any given time. Again, that's our primary objective, know the state of our network at any time. It informs us on the relative risks of different threats, and it makes it possible for systems personnel to identify and mitigate flaws at near network speed. And as we discussed last week, vulnerabilities or flaws or misconfigurations are what lead to security incidents. The CDM program falls under a blanket purchase agreement where Homeland Security, in partnership with General Services Administration, established a government-wide acquisition vehicle called a blanket purchase agreement for continuous diagnostic capabilities. So the tools, the sensors, the capabilities that allow us to do continuous diagnostics and mitigation are provided through a purchasing function called a blanket purchase agreement. The purpose of the blanket purchase agreement, which applies to federal, state, local entities, is to provide a consistent government-wide set of continuous diagnostic solutions to enhance the government's ability to identify and mitigate the impact of emergent cyber threats, and to capitalize on strategic sourcing to minimize costs of continuous diagnostic implementation. Program objectives for CDM: they provide the security, the tools, the integration services, and the dashboards to organizations to support them in improving their cybersecurity posture. Program objectives are under number 1, reduce the threat surface. Number 2, increase visibility into the cybersecurity posture, which is continuous visibility. Number 3, improve cybersecurity response capabilities. And 4, streamline Federal Information Security Modernization Act, or FISMA, reporting. So we want to make sure we can report on all these capabilities. The CDM capabilities and tools objectives: number 1, we have a dashboard which receives, aggregates, and displays information from the CDM tools. Then we have 4 main focus areas: identity and asset management, which manages hardware assets, hardware asset management, software asset management, configuration settings, CSM, and software vulnerabilities, or VUL. Then we have identity and access management, which manages accounts, access, privileges, which is PRIV, trust determination for people granted access, trust, credentials and authentication, and security-related training, behave. Network security management manages network and perimeter components, host and device components, data at rest and in transit, and user behavior and activity. So this is more managing the flow, the connections, the implementation of IT functions so that we can measure the security ongoing. Includes management of events, or MNG EVT, operate, monitor, and improve, OMI, design and build in security, DBS, boundary protection, bound, supply chain risk management, SCRM, and ongoing authorization. And finally, data protection management. Manages protection of data through the capabilities of data discovery and classification, DISC, data protection, PROT, data loss prevention, DLP, data breach spillage information, SPIL, and information rights management, IRM. So the vision, the mission, and the reporting of CDM. The overall vision of CDM is to identify and prioritize cybersecurity risk on a continuous basis, and continuous is key here, while enabling agency cybersecurity professionals to manage and mitigate risk to government data and networks. When we say agency officials, basically we're looking for each agency of the federal government to implement the CDM capability, so each agency can protect the assets that they're responsible for. The CDM mission: through partnerships with agencies and industry, the CDM program fortifies the cybersecurity of all civilian government data and networks by providing capabilities. Agency dashboards provide reporting. These are tools that produce customized reports and alerts analysts to the most critical cybersecurity risks. So if we're going to have visibility and monitoring, we have to report that back through dashboards. Compares desired state to actual state of object level data. So this relates to the NIST cybersecurity framework, where we're actually looking for both desired state and actual state, and also currently being implemented to agencies via shared services platform. So the CDM reporting capability is being implemented right now as we speak. As far as federal dashboards reporting, it's a tool that consolidates the summary information from each agency dashboard. So each agency dashboard collects information about that agency, and those are summarized through a federal dashboard. It forms a picture of cybersecurity health across all civilian agencies, allows a correlation of threat data to improve vulnerability prioritization. How does CDM work? Well, first is commercial off-the-shelf tools that are being purchased by these agencies using the blanket purchase agreement for the government. So the government will pre-qualify tools and vendors that can be used for CDM by making sure that they meet the requirements of CDM, and then the agencies can purchase these tools to implement CDM within their agency. CDM offers commercial off-the-shelf tools with robust terms for technical modernizations as threat change. There's a three-step process. Number one, install the sensors, which are the tools, which our organization installs sensors, perform an automated search for known cyber flaws. And as we said earlier, the cyber flaws are what lead to successful attacks. Then we collect events and prioritize alerts. Results feed into a local report, alerting network managers to their worst and most critical cyber risks based on standardized and weighted risk scores. Prioritize alerts enable organizations to efficiently allocate the resources based on the severity of the risk. And then finally, we establish reports. Progress reports track results, which can be shared amongst sister networks. Summary information can feed into an enterprise-level dashboard to inform and prioritize cyber risk assessments. The results of the program enable organizations to expand their continuous diagnostic capabilities by increasing their network sensor capacity, automating sensor collections, and prioritizing risk alerts. So Homeland Security has set the CDM program to focus on three primary deliverables: endpoint integrity, least privilege and infrastructure integrity, boundary protection, and event management. Endpoint integrity, the scope is the local computing environment, focuses on identifying and managing hardware and software assets, listing known vulnerabilities and malware, and device configuration management. Number two, least privilege and infrastructure integrity is focused on the people in the environment, being able to manage their account and network privileges, managing the configuration of network infrastructure, devices, and services. And finally, three is boundary protection. Event management includes the event detection and response, encryption, remote access management, access control, and ensures security is built into networks rather than added on as an afterthought. And this diagram really shows the components of the CDM program. The outer layer is the dashboards, which provide risk indicator scores and prioritization. The desired state, the actual state, and the gap analysis, again, mapping back to the NIST cybersecurity framework, the three main deliverables of the NIST cybersecurity framework. Inside the dashboard, we're collecting information around assets, what's on the network, hardware asset management, software asset management, configuration settings management, and vulnerability management. We're also collecting information on users, who's on the network, trust, behave, credentials, and privileges. We're also collecting information on boundary conditions and events. How's the network protected, which includes boundary firewalls or filtering, boundary encryption, and boundary physical access controls. We're collecting information on what's happening on the network, manage events, design and build in security, operate, monitor, and improve. And then finally, we're collecting information on the data. How is the data protected? The discovery of data, or data disk, or data discover, data protection, data loss prevention, data spillage, and data information rights management. So let's talk about the functional requirements of CDM. The first is what's on the network. The goal is to establish the scope and authorization boundary by capturing the entire digital attack surface, which again maps back to the risk management framework. We start out by understanding the authorization boundary and the scope. The capabilities include management and control of devices, which is HWAM, management and control of software, SWAM, security configuration settings, or CSM, and software vulnerabilities, which is VUL. Second, capabilities, who's on the network. The goal is to establish a coordinated effort that applies to an entity, including a non-person entity, that accesses any resource, physical or logical, in an organization. These capabilities include the trust determination for people granted access. Can we trust the people who are granted access, which is trust? Security-related behavioral training, which is, are these trusted individuals behaving appropriately, which is behave. Next, we have credentials and authentication. How do we identify for sure and authenticate those individuals through credentials and authentication? And then finally, how do we manage access, which is control of managed privileges, which is PRIV. Third focus area is how the network's protected. Here we want to limit, prevent, and remove unauthorized network connections that allow attackers to cross internal and external boundaries and and pivot to gain deeper network access. Capabilities include network filters, bound F, cryptographic mechanisms, bound E, personnel vehicle access controls, bound P. Next is what's happening on the network, where we move beyond asset management to an extensive and dynamic monitoring of security controls. Capabilities, the identification of security threat vectors, detection of security violation events, and classification of event impacts, manage events, focus on in-depth security root cause analysis, prioritization of security mitigation, response, and recovery, which is operate, monitor, and improve, and address software acquired or newly developed to ensure that security and privacy is built in, design and build in security. And finally, how the data is protected. Data protection management includes the identification of cyber risks on an ongoing basis, prioritizing risks based on potential impacts, enabling the cybersecurity personnel to mitigate the most significant problems first. Capabilities include consistent identification of data assets, data discovery, cryptographic mechanisms and data masking, data protect, fine-grained access controls for data protection, data DLP, response to unauthorized loss of organizational data, data spill, and creation and management of information rights management policies, data IRM. So each of these capabilities, we're going to go into a little bit in depth, starting with hardware asset management, which establishes and maintains a hardware inventory baseline, unique identifiers for hardware, and other properties such as the manager of the hardware. We discover unauthorized, unmanaged hardware on the network. Once the unauthorized or unmanaged hardware is discovered, the organization will take action to remove the hardware. Since unauthorized hardware is unmanaged, it's likely vulnerable. It will be exploited as a pivot to other assets if not removed or managed. The second function under what's on the network is software asset management, or SWAM. SWAM establishes and maintains a software inventory, unique identifiers for software, other properties such as the manager of the software. Here we discover unauthorized, unmanaged software configuration items and IT assets on the network. Once unauthorized or unmanaged software configuration items are discovered, the organization will take action to remove these software configuration items. Because unauthorized software is unmanaged, it's probably vulnerable to being exploited as a pivot to other IT assets if not removed or managed. Third capability under what's on the network is configuration settings management. The configuration settings management establishes and maintains security configuration benchmarks consisting of the acceptable values for each relevant configurable setting for each asset type. The CSM capability reduces misconfiguration of assets, including misconfiguration of hardware devices, physical and virtual machines, as well as those associated with the operating system, as well as software. Cyber adversaries often use automated scanning attacks to search for and exploit assets with misconfigurations and then pivot to attack other assets. And then the final capability or function under the what's on the network is vulnerability management. Vulnerability management discovers, identifies, and locates known security vulnerabilities in network assets. The vulnerability management capability discovers vulnerability in assets on the network. Vulnerability management is the management of risks presented by known software weaknesses that are subject to exploitation. Vulnerability management function ensures that mistakes and deficiencies are identified. Information security vulnerability is a deficiency in software that a hacker can use to gain access to a system or a network. The next focus area is who's on the network. And we have 4 CDM functions. First is trust determination for people granted access, or trust. Trust validates a person's identity and the degree to which he or she has been vetted. The trust capability reduces the probability of loss and availability, integrity, and confidentiality of data by ensuring that only properly vetted users are given access to systems and credentials, including user, system, and users with elevated privileges and special security roles. This includes the requirement that vetted trust level is properly monitored and renewed. The second function under who's on the network is behave, or security-related behavioral training. Behave identifies the individual has the proper knowledge and training for the roles he or she is assigned and that he or she remains up to date. Behave capability documents that authorized users exhibit appropriate security-related behaviors. For CDM, appropriate security-related behavior is defined as actions that have been explained and agreed to by the user via user agreements, training, job requirements, or similar methods. This capability provides an organization with insight into risks associated with nonconformance with policies for accessing systems and data by authorized users. The third CDM requirement under who's on the network are credentials and authentication. Credentials authentication binds a type of credential authentication mechanism to an identity established in trust with a level of assurance and is used to grant access, both physical and logical. The credential and authentication capability reduces the probability of loss and availability, integrity, and the confidentiality of data by ensuring that only proper credentials are authenticated to system services and facilities. This includes the requirement that credentials are properly monitored and renewed per organization policy. The capability is intended to ensure that credentials for both physical and logical access are assigned to and only used by authorized users of service that require access to perform the specific job functions. And then finally, we have management control of accounts, access, and managed privileges, which is called PRIV. PRIV establishes the privileges associated with the credential and, in turn, the individual or service. The PRIV capability provides the organization with insight into risks associated with authorized users being granted excessive privileges to facilities and to systems. The intent of this capability is to ensure that privileges for both physical and logical access are assigned to authorized people or accounts that require authorized access for job functions. This capability is dependent on the existence of a set of attributes that denote roles or characteristics that require or restrict specific privileges per policy. The third requirement is how the network is protected, and here we have three functions for protecting the network. We have manage network filters and boundary conditions, which is bound F, manage and monitor cryptographic mechanisms, which is bound E, monitor and manage physical access controls, which is bound P. So we'll start with bound F, reduces the probability that unauthorized traffic will pass through a network boundary. This includes a requirement that the boundary filtering policies are monitored, reviewed, and reauthorized. Managed network filters and boundary conditions include devices such as firewalls, gateways that sit at the boundary between enclaves, such as a trusted internal network or subnet and an external or internal less trusted network. The filters apply sets of rules and heuristics that regulate the flow of traffic between the trusted and less trusted sides of the boundary. Next, we have monitor and manage cryptographic mechanisms, bound E. The bound E capability provides visibility into risks associated with the use of cryptographic mechanisms employed on an organization's network. Cryptography is used to protect credentials, data at rest, data in motion. Bound E provides the organizational indicators of improper cryptographic behavior and/or hardware-software misconfiguration. If cryptography is used, cryptography must be properly implemented and configured to provide the desired state of protection. Bound E collects policies from hardware devices, software products, cryptographic implementation, configuration settings to ensure that the right implementations are being used and configured properly. And then finally, we have monitor and manage physical access controls, bound P. Bound P ensures that personnel and vehicle access to a protected facility boundary is properly authenticated as required by policy, is properly authorized as required by policy, and the events are properly monitored. Physical access control systems are the underlying systems that provide policy rules and events to the bound P services for electronically protecting facility access boundaries. Properly authenticated means the individual presented approved credentials and the cryptographic validation was performed to verify the individual is as represented. The next focus area is what's happening on the network. Here we have three functions: manage events, operate, monitor, and improve, design and build in security. Manage events describes ongoing assessment, preparation for events, incidents, audit data collection from appropriate sources, identifying incidents through the analysis of data. Manage event and OMI, operate, monitor, improve, integrate to provide complementary processes and procedures to strengthen organization's security posture. The manage event capability provides the identification of security threat vectors, detection of security violation events, classification of event impacts. Manage event utilizes an incident management system to report and share events with operate, monitor, and improve. So we have to identify the events first before we can operate, monitor, and improve. OMI describes ongoing authorization, audit data aggregation, correlation, analysis, incident prioritization and response, and post-incident activities such as information sharing. OMI and manage event capabilities integrate to provide complementary processes and procedures to strengthen an organization's security posture. OMI focuses on the in-depth security root cause analysis, prioritization of security mitigation, response, recovery, notification, post-incident activity. OMI uses an incident report to share mitigation information with managed event. And then finally, we have design and build in security under what's happening in the network. Design and build in security describes preventing exploitable vulnerabilities from being effective in the software system while the software system is in development or deployment. So these are upfront capabilities to prevent bad things from happening. This is by designing and building in security in the forefront. The design and build in security capability addresses software acquired or newly developed to ensure that the security is built in during all stages of the system development lifecycle. Design and build-in security and supply chain risk management are used to reduce the attack surface for network infrastructure components in the design, development, deployment areas of the system development lifecycle. The design and build-in secure design area focuses on identifying and establishing motivation and goals for information system security needs. This includes assessing the environment, risk posture, and the design to mitigate those risks. Design and build-in security development area focuses on developing and testing the information system to ensure that the information system security needs are implemented effectively. This includes implementing secure coding practices, identifying and addressing security weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And the final focus area is how is the data protected. Here we have 5 CDM functions: data discovery, data protection, data loss prevention, data spillage, and information rights management. So data discovery and classification describes techniques for identification, discovery, and classification of data. Data discovery is an important foundation to gain knowledge of the what, where, and why of an organization's data. Data classification is a classification of data based on its level of sensitivity and the impact of the organization should that data be disclosed, altered, destroyed without authorization. The classification of data used to determine which baseline security controls are appropriate for safeguarding that data. Next, we have data protection, which describes data protection techniques, focuses on the proper handling of data, including consent, notice, regulatory obligations. Data privacy typically involves whether or how data is shared with third parties, how data is legally collected or stored, regulatory restrictions such as GDPR, HIPAA, GLBA, PCI, etc. Data loss prevention describes techniques to minimize data loss. DLP is a set of tools and processes to ensure sensitive data is not lost, misused, or accessed by unauthorized individuals. DLP software classifies regulated, confidential, and business critical data, identifies violations of policies defined by organizations. Once violations are identified, DLP enforces remediation with alerts, encryption, protection actions to prevent accidental or malicious sharing of that data that could put the organization at risk. Next, we have data breach or data spillage, which describes techniques for the response and recovery of activities of data breach and spillage. A security incident that occurs whenever classified data is spilled either onto an unclassified information system or onto an information system with a lower level of classification. A data breach occurs when a cyber criminal successfully infiltrates a data source and extracts sensitive information. This can be done physically by accessing a computer or a network to steal local files or by bypassing networks securely remotely. And finally, information rights management. Information rights management describes data protection functions specific to information rights management. It's an IT security technology used to protect documents containing sensitive information from unauthorized access. IRM applies to documents, spreadsheets, and presentations created by individuals. IRM protects files from unauthorized copying, viewing, printing, forwarding, deleting, and editing. So let's look at the high-level architecture of the CDM capability. There are 4 levels, starting with the tools and the sensors at level A. Those tools and sensors collect information based on the CDM requirements of what's on the network, who's on the network, how's the network protected, what's happening on the network, and how's the data protected. So we have tools and sensors that collect that information. That information is then integrated at layer B, the integration layer. The information is displayed to provide risk reports at the agency dashboard level, layer C, and then it's collected together for an overall federal dashboard at layer D. So this is how the architecture works. It's a 4-level architecture in which the desired state is compared to the actual state. Data collected from the CDM sensors in layer A is integrated in layer B, is then compared to the desired state policies provided in the agency dashboard layer C, as well as the federal dashboard layer D. So how does the architecture work? Continuous diagnostics and mitigation architecture provides a comprehensive and consistent baseline architecture for the flow of CDM data and policies among agency network, agencies, federal level. Agencies can tailor their specific implementations of the architecture to address specific needs. It enables uniform and consistent operation. CDM monitors security controls, analyzes their performance, and sends the results to dashboards at the agency and federal levels. The CDM architecture enables uniform and consistent cross-agency operation of the CDM system. Architecture is both descriptive by providing use cases, recommendations, and future work descriptions, and prescriptive, defining minimum patterns, responsibilities, and constraints that make the CDM system function consistently. It's a 4-layer hierarchy CDM architecture's four-layer hierarchy, sensor and system data flows from the lower levels to the higher, which supply policy, scoring, and analysis information to the lower levels. Layer A, which is the lowest, encompasses the tools and sensors that interact with hardware, software, devices, and databases to provide actual state data. Layer B supports the data integration and normalization and aggregates the actual state data from Layer A for evaluation against the desired state. Layer C is the agency dashboard and the agency's exclusive connection with the federal dashboard, which is at Layer D. The federal dashboard aggregates summary information from and provides standards and policies to agency dashboards. So the data flows upward, the policies flow downward. The two lower layer report scores, security risk and gaps between the desired and the actual state, up to the federal and agency dashboards for further analysis and actions. Desired state policies flow downward from Layer D, federal, Layer C, agency, to Layers B and A. These policies establish the desired state of agency's information security posture based on the threats they face and on the requirements for FISMA. To address emerging threat, additional desired state policies can be sent from federal and agency levels to all agencies in near real time to bolster existing security controls and mitigate the risk. So here's a diagram that describes exactly how the policy flow and the data flow work within the CDM architecture. If we focus first in the middle, we have the four layers. Layer A, tools and sensors at the bottom, feeds up to Layer B, which is the integration layer. Continuous monitoring as a service integration, flows up to Layer C, agency dashboard, which is a repository at the agency level and a display of a current state, as well as Layer D, which is a federal dashboard, which is an aggregate repository, a summary level information. So we start with, on the left-hand side, the policy flows. The policies are basically trying to get at the CDM desired state. The CDM desired state is described in policy. So we push the policy down from the federal dashboard level through the agency dashboard, through the integration layer to the tools and sensors, which is machine-readable desired state attributes. The desired state is where we want to be. The output of the tools are machine-readable actual state attributes. So the tools collect actual attributes and they map them against the desired state attributes. The tools perform the functions as you see on the bottom: hardware asset management, software asset management, configuration settings management, vulnerability management, trust, behave, credentials and privileges, bound F, bound E, bound P, manage events, design and build in security, operate, monitor, and improve, as well as the data protection capabilities, discovery, protection, DLP, spillage, and information rights management. Those tools and sensors collect information around the assets that are in scope for the assessment, which includes the computers, the laptops, the user accounts, the privileged, the routers, the printers, the cloud assets. Those tools and sensors collect that information and provide that data from bottom up in an upward flow. They move that data information up to the Layer B, which is the integration layer, up to Layer C, which is the agency dashboard, to D, which is federal dashboard. And as that data or collected information gets from the bottom to the top, we come up with the actual state attributes. So we can now compare the desired state from the policy to the actual state from the data flow that was collected from the tools and the sensors. These tools and sensors are described as containers and objects that have machine-readable desired attribute values as the input, as well as machine-readable actual attribute values as the output. So the desired values are compared to the actual values, and the actual values are provided from the bottom up into the dashboards at the agency level as well as at the federal level. This is the overall architecture of CDM. So the sensor types are active network sensor, which actively probes a network or a device over the network. Actively sensing large IP ranges takes extended amounts of time, possibly years, is one of the limitations of the active network sensor. So you have to organize your sensors in such a way that they're effectively or efficiently implemented. We also have passive network sensors, which are configured to collect and/or inspect communications that traverse a certain network segment to provide information about network connections to specific content of those connections. The weaknesses here are limited network visibility due to subnetting and segmentation of the network. In other words, we can only see what these sensors are configured to see, and there may be limited visibility. and the device state information can be inaccurate because the necessary level of fidelity is not provided as part of typical network communications. Next, we have Asset Management Repository, which is a repository created and updated as part of the process or activity that manages the asset for an organization. It can also collect asset data acquired by proprietary or external means when the process of collection is not managed by the enterprise, but the results are made available. Some of the weaknesses is limited only devices identified for management that tool or mechanism, and information available is collected and used for different purposes, so it's limited to the data that already provides the format it already uses. Next, we have network event sensors, which is designed to detect and report events of interest to a defined location in a timely manner. A network event sensor differs from a passive network sensor in that it is configured to not just collect information passing over the network segment being monitored, but also perform some level of analysis to identify predefined conditions and then act accordingly. Some of the weaknesses and limitations of network event sensors: associated device information can be inaccurate because the necessary level of fidelity is not provided as part of typical network communications, and the appropriate settings for the thresholds and triggers are not easily defined or determined, which can result in inaccurate identification of events. And finally, we have an endpoint sensor, which is software client installed or natively embedded within the operating system of a device. Some of the weaknesses of the endpoint sensor: potential negative impact on the device due to the increased processor load. Now here's the diagram that shows the tools and the data flows from level A, B, C, and D. Starts with the target workstations and services, Linux servers, Windows servers, Windows workstations. These are the devices or the assets. Then we have the tools and the sensors, which is essentially layer A. Some of the tools that have been approved on the approved product list are Forescout Counter, which does hardware asset management, IBM Big Fix, which does software asset management. IBM Fix also does configuration and settings management, and Tenable does vulnerability management. These are just examples of tools. There are many, many tools that have already been approved on the GSA approved product list. Those sensors collect information and aggregate information and push that up to the collection integration point, which is Splunk is an example. Collection integration again at layer B. And then finally, the dashboards are produced at both the federal and the agency level. The agency dashboards, which are layer C, the federal dashboards, which are layer D, through RSA, R through GRC. Again, all of these technologies and tools are already part of the GSA approved product list. CDM operations. We start again at level A, the tools and sensors. Level A contains the tools and sensors installed at the agency level to interact with the hardware and software components in an agency's information system infrastructure. And they really monitor and collect actual state data. That's what the whole goal of the tools and sensors. And that actual state data are based on the requirements of CDM and are collected by tools that are on the approved product list. That information then is passed up to layer B, which is the integration layer. The integration point is specific to each agency. It compares the information collected in layer A, actual state data, with the desired state policies pushed down from layer C. So the policies are top down, the data is collected bottom up, and at layer B we can compare what we're actually collecting to what our desired state is. The desired state is pushed down from level C. Next is layer C, which is the agency dashboard. Receives results from the data collected and compared in layer B. Produces customized reports that alert network managers to the most critical cyber risk based on a weighted risk indicator scores. And we'll talk in a minute about what we mean by a weighted risk indicator score. It prioritizes alerts to enable agencies to efficiently allocate resources based on risk severity. Sends summary data to the federal dashboard, which is again layer D. Reports desired actual state gaps to both the agency and federal dashboards for further analysis and action. So two main things that come out of layer C. Number one is the gaps between the desired and actual states for those who are measuring for CDM, which is, again, what's on the network, who's on the network, how's the network protected, what's happening on the network, and how's the data protected. And so it measures the desired versus the actual state. It also gives you a risk severity rating based on an algorithm that's designed called the Federal Aware Risk Indicator Score. You can see over on the left-hand side, that information is also pushed down, top down, because we're prioritizing certain gaps or certain risks that are applied within the dashboard. So the AWARE risk indicator, AWARE stands for Agency-Wide Adaptive Risk Environment, which is essentially a way to identify the relative risk of some of these different gaps that we're identifying between the current state and the desired state. And finally, that information is pushed up to the federal dashboard at layer D. It displays agency summary data, provides federal risk scoring and prioritization to the agency dashboard, and it calculates and displays federal risk indicator scores along with local agency-derived risk indicator scores. So the cyber analytics provided at the federal level gets pushed into a AWARE risk indicator score, and that AWARE risk indicator score is applied to each agency dashboard so that the agency can not only identify what their gaps are between the desired and actual state, but also what those gaps turn into being risks based on the federal AWARE risk indicator. Stands for Agency-Wide Adaptive Risk Enumeration. So let's just focus in on those two layers, layers C, agency dashboard, and layer D, federal dashboard. The federal dashboard is summary level data across multiple agencies. The agency dashboard is agency level data, or called object level data, across the single agency. And remember, the information provided to the agency dashboard comes from layers A and B, which are the tools and sensors and the integration layer. So from the federal perspective, the scores and alerts are based on federal policies, federal risk scoring indicators, federal cyber intelligence, federal analysis and metrics, and security alerts. The agency dashboard has summary data, counts and scores of endpoints, software, and vulnerabilities at the agency level. Fundamental FISBA metrics, basically stating that the policies that are pushed down and therefore the data collected back map to the FISBA metrics, and these FISBA metrics are applied through the CDM capabilities of what's on the network, who's on the network, what's happening on the network, etc. So you'll see that those capabilities map to the NIST risk management framework, the NIST cybersecurity framework, as well as NIST 853 is what is the basis of FISMA. We have verified vulnerabilities from CDM sensors. So what is AWARE risk indicator scoring? Agency-wide adaptive risk enumeration. So we have automated feeds from federal dashboards, automated feeds from agency tools and sensors, and agency designations are all fed into this algorithm. So from the federal dashboards, which are the layer D, we have National Vulnerability Database, we have DISA State Configuration Security, we have Federal Vulnerability Actions. From the feeds from the agency tools and sensors up through the integration layer, we have vulnerability data, configuration setting data, unauthorized hardware data, and then we have agency designations such as the high value, the asset value. Those are all collected together into this algorithm, which gives you ultimately federal scores, which are actual total, actual average, anticipated total, and anticipated average. So that's how the architecture works. The architecture is really, really important with CDM because it shows how the tools and sensors at layer A are collected and integrated at layer B and provide information to dashboards, which include the desired state and the actual state and the comparison between the two, as well as risk indicator scores from the AWARE algorithm. So CDM happens in stages as far as the operations. Step 1 and 2, where we perform live discovery, vulnerability assessment, encompasses all the traditional and modern assets to provide the visibility needed to determine what assets are on the network and to what extent they are secured and exposed. Here we have step 3 and 4. Once this information has been collected, map the organization's mission to determine what's important, including assets use and criticality, enriching using other data sources, including whether the vulnerability is currently being exploited. And finally, step 5 and 6 is prioritize scarce resources and efforts to mitigate those vulnerabilities that most directly affect the mission, leverage cyber exposure data to drive strategic discussions and investment decisions based on quantifying risks in the context of the organization and its missions. So the CDM hardware and software asset management use case, where we have the agency network, we have hardware assets and software assets. We are scanning those hardware and software assets every 72 hours to identify any known and unknown assets. This is specifically what we're looking for, our assets The CDM tools and sensors that are part of the GSA approved product list will scan those devices, and in the dashboard, we will have known hardware assets, known software assets, unknown hardware assets, unknown software assets, which is what we're measuring as far as the actual state and the desired state. If instead we're looking at patch and vulnerability management, where vulnerability management fixes the worst problems first, we have agency software assets, which are the software names and versions on the agency. We have CDM vulnerability scanning tools, which are on the approved product list, where networks are scanned every 72 hours to identify the vulnerabilities. And at the agency dashboard, we have the discovered vulnerabilities. We can compare those against the actual state of vulnerabilities with the desired state of vulnerabilities to come up with a score. The phases of CDM, there are 4 phases. This is basically how CDM has been implemented within the federal government. CDM phase 1, identify and audit what's on the agency network, hardware and software. CDM phase 2, identify who is on the agency network and set privileges for access. CDM phase 3, identify what's happening on the agency network. CDM phase 4, provide the capability for data protection. Each phase is designed to answer specific questions. What's on the network involves deploying products to automate hardware, software, asset management, configuration settings, and common vulnerability management capabilities. Phase 2, which is who's on the network, intends to address privilege management, infrastructure integrity by allowing agencies to monitor users on their network, detect whether the users are engaging in unauthorized activity. Phase 3, what's happening on the network, includes detection capabilities that are intended to assess agency network activity, identify any anomalies that may indicate cybersecurity compromise. And then phase 4, what role for emergent tools and technologies, provides tools to protect data at rest, in transit, in use, prevent data loss, and manage and mitigate data breaches. Some of the technical benefits of CDM provide cyber professionals with real-time analysis of their networks, which is the key, real-time analysis of networks. With that analysis of networks, we can assess risks and threats. We can mitigate and identify flaws at network speed. We create a smaller attack surface, decrease risk for operational networks. We can find weaknesses and vulnerabilities, improve hardware asset management, software asset management, vulnerability management. We can create dashboards to show network security. So this is the first time we can really create standard dashboards to show network security, and we can compare those dashboards. And ultimately, we improve the management and trust of people granted access to the network. The business benefits. Provide services to implement sensors and dashboards. We deliver near real-time results. We prioritize the worst problems within minutes versus quarterly or annually. We enable defenders to identify and mitigate flaws at network speed and lower operational risk and exploitation of government IT systems and networks. All of this enhances government network security through the automated control testing and progress tracking. In addition, for federal cyber investments, the CDM program fulfills FISMA mandates, so we comply with the FISMA requirements. CDM program is designed to rigorously ensure personal privacy, and data from the CDM participant networks. The Department of Homeland Security does not include any PII. It only includes information about the security of the devices. It doesn't include the information itself that we're trying to protect. The end goal of CDM. We start by installing network sensors at each organization that perform automated searches for vulnerabilities. Second, we feed the results into dashboards that can create customized reports and alerts. Third, we allow managers to allocate resources to the best way to mitigate the risks. Fourth, we consistently track results and compare organizational and enterprise effectiveness. And 5, we develop enterprise-level dashboards to provide enterprise-wide situational awareness. This is the continuous risk identification and mitigation, which is the overall end goal of CDM. When we map CDM to the NIST cybersecurity framework, as we've mentioned a couple of times, there's a very strong alignment with the 5 main functions: what's on the network, who's on the network, how the network is protected, what's happening on the network, and how the data is protected, map very closely to the NIST cybersecurity framework. So that's why we are in line with NIST requirements for a cybersecurity program. So what we've taken NIST from a risk level, and CDM actually engineers our solutions in order to meet the requirements that have been defined by NIST. So let's look at the requirements, the frameworks, and deliverables and put the whole thing together from an engineering perspective. We start with an assessment where we are now, the current design. The strategy is where we want to be, the target design. The gap analysis, what are the gaps? And CDM definitely provides gaps between the desired state and the current state. The plan of action is how do we get there? Once we know the gaps, we can put together a roadmap to get us from the current state to the desired state. And the results are how do we know our impact? And there are really 5 main deliverables from the CDM program. What's on the network? Who's on the network? How the network's protected? What's happening on the network? And how the data is protected. So those 5 questions can now be answered by implementing CDM. We can answer through dashboards what's on the network versus what should be on the network. We can answer on dashboard who's on the network versus who should be on the network. We can answer through dashboards how's the network protected versus how the network should be protected. What's happening on the network versus what should be happening on the network, and how's the data protected versus how the data should be protected. Again, comparing the actual state with the desired state. So what are the tools and functionalities that focus on what's on the network, which is the first deliverable? The focus again here is on level A, the tools and sensors. Without these tools and sensors, we could not get integration, we could not get dashboards at the agency or the federal level. So these are the tools and sensors for hardware asset management. We have passive detection tools. We have tools to interrogate network infrastructure to detect devices. We have active scanning tools. We have tools that provide packet filtering for device identification. And all these functions of tools have been integrated into the blanket purchase agreement. So any tool that's been approved for use has these capabilities for hardware asset management built in. Similarly, for software asset management, blacklisting, whitelisting, software version scanning, and license management tools. For configuration settings management, we have security content automated protocol, which is SCAP configuration and assessment tools, common configuration element or CCE, unique identifier assessment tools, and common configuration scoring system or CCSS tools for configuration management. For vulnerability management, we have vulnerability scanners, web application scanners, database scanners, and imported published vulnerabilities. Again, these tool functionalities are requirements of these tools that are built into the requirements for the blanket purchase agreement, and any tool or product that's approved for use must have these capabilities. Under the who's on the network, we start with trust for people granted access. We have audit reporting and policy management. Under security-related behavioral training, we have audit reporting, learning management system, security-related behavior management. Again, audit reporting is important here because the audit will tell us whether or not the individual getting access based on trust and behavior are meeting the ultimate requirements. We have to report back on what they're currently doing versus what they're required to do. Credentials and authentication tools, X.509 certificates, PKI, identity and access management, access certifications, authentication mechanisms, and audit reporting. Under the control of account, access managed privileges, we have identity and access management, privileged account management, credential management, compliance verification. We are now looking at the tools that reflect how the network's protected. We have network filters and boundary controls, forward web proxies, reverse web proxies, web application firewalls. We have email gateways, database firewalls, network access protection, intrusion detection, a lot of different functions for our network filters and boundary controls, which is bound F tools. We have use of encryption mechanisms, which are bound E tools, digital signing for email, digital key management, network access authentication, certificate management, email encryption, DNS record signing through DNS security protocol, secure remote login, secure shell, transport encryption, network layer, IPsec, or transport layer, TLS security protocols. And under protected physical boundaries for personnel and vehicle access, or bound P tools, we have possession of a valid token, identification, authentication, a token with a PIN, identification, stronger authentication such as biometrics, need to know, group membership, security clearance, training and certification, physical security training specific to the area, and movement between less trusted and more trusted areas incorporates previous access controls. Tools for managing what's happening on the network. We start with manage events, event-driven polling reporting, event-driven interrupt reporting, log management, near real-time analytics, initial incident report generation, confidentiality of sensitive information, Data minimization and retention, backup and restore, organization recovery time objective, recovery point objective, forensic tools, network packet capture. For operate, monitor, and improve, we have anomalous behavior detection, patch OS and application management, impact including function, information, mission, business analysis tools, advanced analysis and visualization tools, mission essential business function tools, threat intelligence feeds, security testing tools to support risk assessment. For design and building security functionalities, we have application analysis for common weaknesses and enumerations, or CWEs, vulnerability scanners for common vulnerabilities and exposures, or CVEs, requirements change management traceability tools, version and change control system, black box, white box, and penetration testing, static dynamic code analysis, patch management, deployment and release management, attack surface mapping analysis, hardening operating system tools, and problem tracking software signing tools. And then finally, for how the data is protected, again, we have 5 different focus areas here. The first one being data discovery and classification. Tools include visualization of classification results, classify data based on classifier type associated with data classification, maintain data dictionary terms and definitions, notification workflow, approval routing capabilities, rule-based data classifier, flexible tag creation and assignment tool, classification and categorization of data and data types. Under data protection, we have cryptographic anchoring, discretionary access control, mandatory access control, role-based, attribute-based, adaptive, risk-based access control, application encryption, file encryption, full disk encryption, storage container encryption, static data masking, extraction, transformation, load or ETL data masking, dynamic data masking, substitution, shuffling, tokenization, number variants, redaction and suppression, format preserving encryption. All these are ways to protect data. For data loss prevention, we have regulatory rules, policy interpretation, translation, endpoint functionalities, DLP network inspection functions, DLP alerts and notifications, DLP incident reporting, DLP blocking and quarantine, security orchestration control, and management of data protection capabilities. For CDM functions around data breach and spillage, we have identified specific data security privacy controls that cause a data breach and spillage, assess the effectiveness of controls, determine the areas of noncompliance, provide the data that enables the organization to assess severity impact, provide tools that look across log files for related events to synthesize potential breach scenarios, assess the impact to the organization of normal operations, send incident reports and alerts, notify to internal and external organization, quantify the loss, compute mean time to recovery, or enhance existing data privacy controls. For information rights management, we have data repositories such as file shares. We have office automation applications such as mail and word processing, cloud applications, file storage and service providers. We have log event analysis systems, SIM, and user behavioral analysis. We have enterprise DLP. We have data discovery. We have identity and access management to include attributes such as Active Directory. And we have multimedia collaboration information sharing platforms, sharing internal and external users. So let's look at the frameworks, which kind of put all of this together. We start always with the critical assets. What's the thing? What's it do? What's it have access to? Who controls it? We look at security by design, requirements to design before the attack, implementation, operations, and monitoring during the attack, testing, verification, and maintenance after the attack. Then we map the CDM functions, which is the basis of our engineering program. What's on the network? Who's on the network before the attack? How's the network protected? What's happening on the network during the attack? How's the data protected after the attack? Tools and sensors from CDM, hardware asset management, software asset management, configuration settings management, vulnerability management, trust, behave, credentials, privileges before the attack. Bound F, Bound E, Bound P, manage events, design, build, and security, operate, monitor, improve during the attack. Data discovery, data protection, data loss prevention, data spillage, data information rights management after the attack. Those all provide dashboards through agency and federal dashboards, as well as the AWARE algorithm to provide a risk level for each of these risks that we identified that are gaps between the current state and the desired state. And we also have stages of operations, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. Stage 1, again, is what's on the network. Stage 2, who's on the network. Stage 3 is what's happening on the network. And stage 4 is how's the data protected. The deliverables from the cybersecurity engineering program. We have 3 main deliverables. We have the workloads, what's on the network, workloads, who's on the network, Workloads, how's the network protected? Workloads, what's happening on the network? Workloads, how the data protected? We have tools and sensors. What's on the network? Tools and sensors allow us to implement those workloads of what's on the network. Tools and sensors that allow us to implement the workloads. Who's on the network? Tools and sensors allows us to implement the workloads. How's the network protected? Tools and sensors that allow us to implement the workloads. What's happening on the network? Tools and sensors that allow us to implement the workloads. How's the data protected? And then finally, we have cyber dashboards in the AWARE scorecard, agency-wide adaptive risk enumeration scorecard. Goal number 1, motivate IT administrators to reduce risk by comparing scores. Not only are we comparing the scores themselves of the desired state versus the current state, but we're also comparing the risk based on the AWARE algorithm, because certain gaps are more critical than others. So we have the risk score between the current risk state and the desired risk state. Motivate management to support risk decisions by quantifying risk. We want to measure the improvement in performance by tracking risk over time. So results are frameworks, risk, engineering, and operations. Here last week we talked about layer 1 resources, which is at the risk level. Here we're talking about layer 2 resources, which is at the engineering level. Layer 1 was risk management framework, cybersecurity framework, and a risk reporting model. This week, layer 2 is the CDM technical requirements, CDM tools and sensors, and the CDM technical dashboard. So you can see we're starting to build a picture of where we're going with the security program. So far, we've talked about risk. We've also talked about engineering, and next week we'll complete this diagram by putting the operations layer in, and then we'll have a full diagram for how to build a cybersecurity program. So the deliverables for risk, engineering, and operations, we can now list the deliverables for risk, which was last week's lecture, cybersecurity strategy, policy, and risk reporting. We can now list the deliverables for engineering, workloads, technologies, and dashboards. And next week, we'll be able to list the deliverables for operations. So we have frameworks that map to deliverables, which is really key. So, okay, now let's take a look and see how we apply the CDM model or an engineering case study to a global healthcare pandemic, the same pandemic that we discussed last week, which is the coronavirus or COVID-19 pandemic. Again, who controls it is the key question here. At the government level, we have the federal government, which controls the national cases, the supply chain, the U.S. healthcare operations, U.S. economy, and the message. Again, controlling the message is key. Who controls at the state level, which is the state government, the Massachusetts cases, the Massachusetts fatalities, the Massachusetts healthcare capacity, the Massachusetts economy, and ultimately the message, who controls the message. These are the same kinds of things that you want to think about in risk. Who controls the actual risk and who controls the message, both at the organizational level as well as at the department level. Organization-wide, system-level perspective. Once again, we discussed this last week. The big picture is who's accountable. The federal level is the federal government. For engineering, which maps to what we're talking about this week, we're now looking at the CDC at the federal level and the Department of Health and Human Services at the state level. So that's what we focus on this week is the analogy of our CDM program at both the agency level, which would be the equivalent of the state level, and at the federal government level, which would be analogous to the CDC. And then ultimately, the operational level we'll be discussing next week, which includes the FEMA for the federal level and the mass healthcare system for the state level. If we were going to put together a pandemic engineering framework, this is what it would look like. It would contain 7 different capabilities, starting out with dashboards, and dashboards that really display the desired state, the actual state, the gap analysis, and the POAM. Instead of applying those to cyber risk, we would apply these to pandemic risks. Next, we would identify the potential cases, the confirmed recoveries, the confirmed fatalities. We would then want to prevent boundary closing, social distancing, government shutdown, FDA-approved vaccine. We would then want to detect testing criteria, diagnostic testing, antibody testing, contact tracing. We would want to contain government guidelines, early intervention, quarantine, isolation, face masks, and PPE. We would want to treat first responders, healthcare workers, clinical trials, oxygen, and ventilators. And we want to restore government criteria, flattening the curve, rolling reentry, workplace practices. So if we were designing tools and sensors for the pandemic, we would want to make sure that those tools and sensors would be able to provide both the current state as well as the desired state for each of these capabilities and be able to report those up to dashboards. That's fundamentally what we're looking to do for an engineering practice around the pandemic. And based on the CDM model, this is what it would look like. We would have a COVID-19 desired state, which was we desired information at the federal level as well as the state level. We would also want a COVID-19 actual state. Where are we today compared to the desired state? We'd start with a federal level dashboard, which is D, move that down to a state level dashboard. We'd have 50 state level dashboards because we really want to measure the COVID-19 at each state. The integration there of the dashboard to the sensors, and that's basically at level B, where we collect the information from the sensors and compare that with the desired state from the dashboards to come up with an actual score. And the tools and sensors, again, at the operational level, are really used to collect that information. So the information, again, is in the identify, prevent, detect, contain, treat, and restore. That's what the tools and sensors allow us to do. And we want to measure that for different groups of people. And potentially we want to collect that based on age, under 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, 40 to 50, 50 to 60, et cetera. And we want to measure that consistently across all 50 states. So this would be my recommendation on how we would engineer a solution for a pandemic. Now, in this case, we're talking about COVID-19, but any pandemic we could measure using this model. This is the key to the whole thing, is the ability to have tools and sensors to identify, prevent, detect, contain, treat, and restore, compare the current state with the desired state pushed down by policy, the current state pushed up by data flow, where we're collecting that information against our population. Our population happen to be our assets that we're collecting that from. We're integrating the information through CMAS integration, continuous monitoring as a service, and displaying that information at state level dashboards as well as government level dashboards. So for the federal dashboard, we would have federal policies, federal risk indicator scoring, federal COVID-19 intelligence, federal analytics and metrics, and COVID-19 alerts. At the state level, we would have counts and scores at risk populations, under 20, 20 to 30, et cetera, fundamental Department of Public Health metrics, verified vulnerabilities from CDM sensors, gives us our state level dashboard. So you can see you can apply the same principles at the engineering level of a global healthcare pandemic risk as we can apply to a cybersecurity risk. And in general, you can apply these principles to any type of risk, any type of future unknown event. We can establish a desired state. We can compare that to the actual state, and we can measure that through dashboards. These are the operational controls that are implemented through the tools and sensors. We talked about briefly. Under identify, we have the pandemic criteria, which basically determine what capabilities we want to implement in the controls. The output includes World Health Organization, CDC, Department of Public Health alignment, making sure that we're collecting the information consistently across those different organizations. We have coming up with a pandemic readiness assessment, high risk notification, or the hotspots, general population, media communications and awareness, pandemic readiness exercises, lessons learned, communications to stakeholders, to media, to the public, pandemic readiness metrics and reporting. Under the prevent function, we have prevention criteria, strategy, policy, and KPIs that we are going to use to measure our current prevention capabilities. World Health Organization, Center for Disease Control, Department of Public Health alignment, making sure we are consistent at a global, at a national, and at a state level. We have prevention at work and at home criteria, employees and individuals, prevention for high risk, criteria for the most vulnerable, vaccine development, pandemic prevention exercises, pandemic communications, pandemic prevention metrics and reporting. We have a detect function, detection criteria, strategy, policy, KPIs, same alignment, asymptomatic, symptomatic indicators, testing and validation, immunity indicators, antibody testing and validation, contact tracing, pandemic detection exercises and lessons learned, detection communication, stakeholder, media, public, pandemic detection metrics and reporting. the idea here is you would have an individual or a group responsible for each of these 6 different functions, and their job are to provide the metrics and the reporting for each of these functions against the desired state by measuring the current state for each of these different areas. And once again, all of these operational capabilities map back to the 6 core functions: identify, prevent, detect, contain, treat, and restore, as well as the categories. The main categories are potential cases, confirmed recoveries, confirmed fatalities. Under prevent, boundary closing, social distancing, government shutdown, FDA-approved vaccine. Under detect, testing criteria, diagnostic testing, antibody testing, contact tracing. Under contain, we have government guidelines, early intervention, quarantine isolation, face masks and PPE. Under treat, first responders, healthcare workers, clinical trials, oxygen and ventilators. And under restore, government criteria, flattening the curve, rolling reentry, and workplace practices. All these operational controls, COV01 through COV48, are applied within each of these categories of controls, mapping back to the core functionalities that are defined by the pandemic controls capability. So this would be the overall pandemic framework, operational controls that allow us to mitigate the pandemic. And here's the map. Last week we talked at the risk level. This week we talked at the engineering level. Same way we talked about managing cyber risk, you would want to be managing COVID-19 risk. Again, the highest level maps to the risk management framework and the cybersecurity framework. The engineering level maps to the Center of Disease Control, or which is equivalent to the CDM, technical tools and sensors and dashboards. So we would want to form a U.S. national program summary. We were looking at the national level. We have the frameworks, so the federal risk management, federal pandemic, federal risk reporting frameworks. From the deliverables, we'd have a pandemic strategy, policy, and risk reporting. At the engineering level, we would have a CDC technical architecture, CDC tools and sensors, CDC technical dashboards, which is COVID scoring. And the deliverables would CDC pandemic workloads, CDC pandemic technologies and practices, CDC pandemic metrics and reporting. Similarly, if we had a state program, again, there'd be 50 of these state programs. Each of these state programs would map up to the federal program. Once again, looks exactly the same as the federal program. It's just that our scope is different. Our scope now is focusing on Massachusetts, whereas the scope of the federal program is all 50 states, essentially applying the same kinds of capabilities. By doing this, we have just an approach to COVID-19. You can share information with other states to make sure you're implementing the same controls the same way and getting the same results, and then map that up to the overall federal government. That's the whole idea here, is a repeatable standard process. And anything that doesn't work, you could identify it quickly, you could validate it against all other states, and you could you could change the controls, you could change the operational capabilities in a near real-time basis. And once again, we've talked about this at the federal level. We used to have the same pandemic layers, pandemic frameworks, and pandemic program deliverables. In this case, at the state level, so different people would be responsible, and our metrics would cover just Massachusetts versus the federal level. Again, different people, different departments responsible, and the metrics would be at a national level. So that concludes week 3, where we talked about engineering principles, engineering frameworks, engineering deliverables. So you have an idea now on how we're going to approach this class from an engineering perspective, and it ties the high-level information from a risk perspective ultimately to the operational discussion, which we'll have next week, where we'll talk about operational security control.